The brutal abuse of black male slaves by white women is hard to stomach. He wasn't just beaten in the fields, he was forced to the bedroom, turned to a sex slave, destined to fulfill the lust of his mistress, then punished for breathing too loudly. While history casts white women as passive, many were inhumane. What they did to enslaved black men wasn't just physical, it was mental and devastating. This is the side of slavery no one talks about, the violence behind the curtain, the cruelty in places of comfort. Because when told, the truth burns, and once you hear it, you can't unsee it. He wasn't just property, he was prey. He stood with chains digging into his wrists, blood trailing down his back, not from the whip of a white man, but from the fingernails of a woman who called herself refined. She watched him cry out, not in anger, but in satisfaction. Her cruelty didn't hide behind fear. It paraded as power. This isn't the story they teach in schools, because this part of history unsettles even the loudest voices. It wasn't just white men brutalizing enslaved black men. White women, wives, daughters, mistresses inflicted their own kind of terror, and often it was worse because it came wrapped in lace and silence. Enslaved men were expected to be strong, but strength didn't save them. It made them targets. Some white women used them as laborers by day and as objects of twisted fantasies by night. No consent, no humanity, just control. They didn't see him as a man. They saw him as a thing, something to own, command, and discard. When he resisted, the punishment was swift, public, humiliating, violent. And when he didn't resist, the silence was even heavier because no one spoke of what happened behind closed doors. His pain had no witness, no voice. These men weren't allowed to scream, but history should. Because this wasn't just a system of forced labor, it was a system of desecration, one that mutilated the body and mind. The truth? She smiled while he bled. That smile was history's quietest scream, and we've been ignoring it for too long. History likes to paint her as delicate, trapped, powerless beside the raging brutality of her husband. But that's only half the truth, and half-truths are dangerous. White women weren't just bystanders to slavery. Many were active participants. Some orchestrated the punishment. Some demanded it. Some took pleasure in it. Their hands might not have always held the whip, but their words, orders, and silence were just as sharp. She wasn't merely watching. She was choosing. Choosing who got fed, who got sold, who got broken. On southern plantations, the mistress wasn't just a lady of the house. She was a gatekeeper of pain, a silent enforcer, a manipulator. Sometimes she punished not for disobedience, but for existing. A glance she didn't like, a body that intimidated her, a smile she couldn't control. That was enough. If she felt threatened, humiliated, or jealous, he paid the price. Publicly, viciously, and she made sure everyone knew who gave the order. She knew the system. She understood what would happen if she accused an enslaved man of disrespect. And still, she did it, sometimes with lies, sometimes with intent, and sometimes just because she could. It's easier to imagine the white man as the villain. Easier to believe women had no choice. But this comfort protects a lie, because cruelty isn't gendered. Power corrupts anyone allowed to wield it without consequence. She wasn't always forced to be cruel. Sometimes she volunteered, and while his body carried the scars of the master's lash, his spirit carried the wounds left by the mistress's voice. Her punishments didn't always bleed, but they were bruised, and they lasted. History may try to forget her role, but silence doesn't erase guilt. It only delays justice. He wasn't invited, he was summoned. When the sun went down and the fields emptied, another kind of labor began, one that didn't involve tools or crops, but still stripped him of control. Her bedroom wasn't a place of rest, it was another plantation, and she ruled it with silence, entitlement, and threat. There was no choice, no desire, only survival. Enslaved black men were forced into sexual submission by white women who saw them not as human beings, but as bodies to conquer. They were coerced, manipulated, and threatened, told to obey or face the whip, the noose, or the auction block. Refusing wasn't bravery. It was suicide. These encounters weren't relationships. They were calculated violations. Abuse dressed in perfume. She might call him in the middle of the night, demand him while her husband was gone, use him, then disappear behind her status and smile. And if word ever got out, he would be the one who suffered, not her. She held all the power. He held none. There are records, quiet, cautious, incomplete, of men fathering children they never asked for, of being labeled studs and breeders, of being punished for the very pregnancies they never consented to. Their masculinity was turned against them. Their strength became their curse, and when she tired of him, she accused him of assault, or had him beaten for being inappropriate. The same woman who forced him into her bed could erase him with one lie. He wasn't safe in the fields, but the bedroom, that was war. This isn't just uncomfortable history, it's erased history. And behind every silent scream is a truth we've refused to face. Consent cannot exist under chains, and in those dark rooms his chains never came off. He didn't speak. He didn't fight. He just stood tall, and that was enough. Sometimes he didn't have to say a word to be hated. His height, his posture, the way he held his eyes just above the ground, it all became a threat. Pride wasn't allowed. Not in a black man, not in chains. To the white mistress, his presence was an insult. She saw defiance where there was only dignity. She called it arrogance, called it disrespect. But what she really meant was, he dared to exist without shrinking. And for that, she made him pay. She didn't need a reason. He looked too proud was reason enough. That was all it took for punishment. Sometimes she accused him of staring, other times of ignoring her. Most times she didn't explain anything at all, just sent for someone to strip him down and break his body so his spirit would follow. She feared what he represented, a strength she couldn't control, a calm she couldn't shatter, a manhood that refused to crawl. So she used the only power she had, humiliation. She'd have him whipped in front of others, forced to kneel, to beg, to perform. She wanted his silence loud, his shame as visible, his pain a warning to anyone else who dared to stand too straight. This wasn't about rules, it was about power, her power, his erasure. The crime wasn't what he did, it was who he was. And in a world built on control, a proud black man was more dangerous than a rebellious one. So they punished the pride, beat it down, buried it. But even in silence, it never truly disappeared. That's what terrified her most. He wasn't just another slave to her. He was hers. She gave him a nickname, mocking, degrading, never kind. Not because she liked him, but because it amused her. He wasn't a man in her eyes. He was entertainment, a living toy to break, rebuild, and break again. Over and over, she had her favorites, not in affection, but in cruelty. There were men she singled out daily, not for special treatment, but for special humiliation. She wanted him to feel watched, controlled, owned, not just by labor, but by her attention. Sometimes she made him dance for guests, sing songs he didn't know, strip down to nothing and stand still while she laughed. If he flinched, she snapped. If he showed emotion, she punished it. Her power wasn't just physical, it was psychological. She didn't just want obedience, she wanted submission. She toyed with his identity, changed his name, mocked his voice, imitated how he walked. She found new ways to remind him he was beneath her. And when she was bored, she created new rules just so he could break them and suffer the consequences. The punishments were often designed for shame, forced exposure, sexual degradation, public ridicule. She didn't whip with rage, she didn't scream, she smiled, calm, deliberate, cold. This wasn't discipline, it was a sport. Some of the most brutal wounds he carried were invisible, not the lash, but the stare, not the bruise, but the smirk. She studied how far she could push before he broke, and when he broke, she did it again. She didn't need a whip to hurt him. Her attention was sharp enough, and the worst part, she knew exactly what she was doing. That's what made it sadistic. That's what made it personal. They say she was trapped, powerless, just another victim of a man's world. But the truth? She had keys, and she used them. The white mistress wasn't some silent figure lost in her husband's shadow. She ran to the house. She managed the staff. She decided who ate, who suffered, who lived in the big house, and who got sent back to the fields. She wasn't on the edge of the system. She was built into its center, and when it came to punishment, she didn't just allow it, she ordered it. She didn't always raise the whip, but she pointed to the back that should be whipped. She used the system to settle grudges, to crush resistance, to keep herself elevated. She wasn't afraid to lie. He disrespected me. That was enough. With a few words, she could destroy a man, have him beaten, castrated, killed, and everyone would believe her. Because in a world that refused to see black men as human, her word was law. Some mistresses reveled in their control. Their cruelty wasn't reluctant, it was precise. Calculated. I enjoyed it. They hid behind lace and lineage, but their hearts were cold, their hands bloodless, their intentions sharp. Even when they weren't cruel, they were complicit. They saw the bruises, I heard the screams, gave the orders, said nothing, and yet history wants to paint them as victims, fragile flowers, helpless wives caught in a man's world. But they weren't powerless. They were protected, and they used that protection like a weapon. She didn't just uphold the system, she shaped it, maintained it, passed it on. So no, she wasn't trapped. She held the leash, and too often she pulled it. He said no, or even worse, said nothing at all. And for that, they made an example out of him. Resistance didn't need to be loud. Sometimes it was a pause, a glance, a refusal to flinch. That was enough to be stripped, bound, and dragged into the open, not just to punish, but to humiliate. Public mutilation was more than cruelty. It was a theater, designed to terrorize the body and break the spirit of everyone watching. White mistresses knew this. Some demanded it. They'd gather the others, men, women, even children, to witness what happened to a black man who didn't submit. His clothes were torn, his dignity was erased, his pain displayed like a lesson written in flesh. He wasn't just whipped, he was degraded, genitals exposed, beaten, sometimes severed. They didn't just want him hurt, they wanted him shamed. And she stood there, watching, calm, composed, sometimes smiling, other times pretending to look away, but always present, because this was about control. Her control. Sexual violence wasn't only done in the shadows. It was dragged into the daylight, used as a message. You are nothing here. Any hint of strength, pride, or resistance was burned out in front of others, and after the crowd scattered and the blood dried, he was left to carry what no one wanted to talk about. The physical scars faded. The shame didn't. He didn't just lose flesh. He lost silence. Privacy, the right to be seen as a man. These weren't isolated incidents. They were deliberate, tactical, rehearsed, because if you can strip a man in public and leave him broken, trembling, and small, you don't just control him, you control everyone watching. The truth was never shouted. It was scribbled, half spoken, half hidden, in ink that trembled with guilt and control. Plantation records weren't written for truth. They were written for order, for profit, for appearances. But if you read closely, really read, you'll find the horror bleeding through the margins. Sent to the big house. Disciplined for insubordination. Assigned breeding duties. Those aren't neutral phrases. They're masks, each one cloaking a deeper violence. Discipline could mean whipping, mutilation, or rape. Breeding wasn't a chore. It was sexual enslavement. And sent to the big house, that often meant a private summons to a white woman's bed. No witness, no choice. Diaries speak of favorites, men she trusted, who made her feel safe, who were different from the others. But beneath the soft language is a brutal reality. These men were exploited, used, controlled, Letters between mistresses spoke of disobedience and punishment, but they rarely described the details. Why? Because everyone already knew. The code was understood. Violence didn't need to be spelled out. It was the air they breathed. Even medical records betray it. Injuries to the groin, swelling, infection. But never the word. Rape. Never the truth. Always a whisper. History didn't forget what happened. It chose not to say it. But the silence isn't clean. It's heavy. Heavy with what was done behind doors and under the protection of whiteness. Behind every vague entry, every passive word, is a man who was stripped of more than freedom. He was stripped of humanity. The records didn't scream, but they didn't lie either. They just assumed no one would care enough to read between the lines. Now we are. And the whispers? They're louder than ever. He wasn't a father. He was a tool. On breeding farms, enslaved black men weren't seen as human. They were labeled studs, reduced to muscle, height, and fertility. No consent, no connection, just orders. He was forced to sleep with women he didn't know, sometimes women he loved like family, sometimes girls, sometimes his own kin. It didn't matter. The goal wasn't life, it was profit. More babies meant more bodies to sell. White owners and mistresses orchestrated it all. They tracked cycles, selected pairings, scheduled rapes like farm chores. They spoke of it like livestock breeding. And when a woman didn't conceive fast enough, the blame fell on him. Whipped, replaced, or sent to another job. They told him it was his duty. They told others he was lucky. But there was no pride in this. No joy. No manhood. Just pain. He couldn't raise the children he fathered. He couldn't name them, couldn't protect them. Sometimes he saw them sold hours after birth, marked as property, like cattle, and if he showed grief, that was a weakness, punishable. White women were part of this too. Some demanded children with certain features. Some selected the strongest men to breed with enslaved women they controlled. Not to build families, but to build inventory. This wasn't about love. It wasn't even about sex. It was industrial rape, calculated, repeated, refined. The trauma didn't stop with the body. It infected generations. Families torn before they even began. Fatherhood twisted into shame. And when the breeding was done, they discarded him. Not as a man, but as worn-out stock. History calls them farms, but what they really were factories of violation. Factories built to multiply suffering, quiet, systemic, profitable, and devastating. She didn't whip him because he disobeyed. She whipped him because he didn't break. Pain wasn't always a response to rebellion. It was the tool to teach obedience. And for enslaved black men, that lesson often began with sexual humiliation. First, she stripped him, not just of clothing, but of dignity, forced him to stand exposed, not for labor, but for domination. His body, his manhood, his silence, all on display. Laughter followed, so did comments, cold, cruel, calculated. Then came the lash, not behind closed doors, but out where others could see. She wanted witnesses, she wanted fear. Each strike wasn't just to hurt, it was to remind him who held the power, her power, the kind that didn't need justification. Sometimes the whipping came after he was used, after she summoned him, touched him, forced herself on him, then punished him for it, as if his body was the crime, as if his suffering restored her control. Other times she called for it before the act. So when he entered her room later that night, he was already bleeding, already broken, already quiet. This was more than violence. It was choreography, a dance of cruelty, physical and sexual abuse back to back, until he stopped looking her in the eye, until he stopped standing tall, until he stopped being himself. She'll make sure he learns obedience, the others would whisper. But obedience wasn't the goal. Erasure was. Because a man who feels shame won't resist. A man stripped of worth won't fight back. And a man who's been humiliated, body, mind, and soul, won't need chains. He'll carry the cage inside him. That's what she wanted. Not just obedience, submission. And she knew exactly how to get it. He knew what would happen if he refused. He said no anyway. In a world where his body wasn't his own, resistance was rare and dangerous. But it existed. Quiet, stubborn, defiant. Some enslaved men chose death over submission. Some chose pain over silence. Not because they thought they would win, but because they refused to be broken. He said no when she called for him at night. No when she reached for him. No when her demands crossed into violation. Sometimes he said it with words. Other times just by stepping back, by lowering his eyes, by not moving. And for that, he was made an example. Some were whipped until unconscious. Some were locked in boxes for days, starved and exposed. Some were castrated. Some never came back. And every time it happened, the message was clear. Saying no wasn't allowed, especially not to her. But still they said it, even knowing the price, even knowing no one would save them. That's what made it powerful. He didn't have armor. He didn't have freedom. All he had was the choice to resist, and he took it. These stories don't appear in textbooks. They're whispered through oral histories, buried in forgotten letters, hidden between lines in plantation records. But they matter, because in a system built to erase resistance, the very act of saying no was rebellion. He didn't say no because he thought he'd win. He said it because his dignity was louder than his fear, and though his voice may have been silenced, his refusal echoes. In a world that tried to own every part of him, he claimed the one thing they could never fully take, his will. That wasn't a weakness. That was courage. When the whip cracked, he clenched his teeth, not because it didn't hurt, but because he wasn't allowed to cry. Tears were dangerous, not to them, but to him. If he cried, they mocked him. If he didn't, they beat harder. His pain was never private. It was a performance for their control, for their amusement, for their twisted sense of power. A black man's suffering was never seen as human. If he winced, they laughed. If he screamed, they called it dramatic. If he stayed quiet, they called it arrogance. There was no way to survive with dignity, so they stripped it away. To white mistresses, his pain was not something to acknowledge, it was something to watch. She called it a correction, but she enjoyed it, not always with a smile, but with attention, with obsession, with repeated orders to do it again, make it worse, make sure he learns. Emotion was weakness, and weakness in him was unacceptable. If he cried, he risked more punishment. If he begged, they said he was trying to manipulate. So he stopped showing anything, stopped reacting, until numbness became a survival strategy. But numbness isn't strength, it's protection. He still felt everything. He just knew it wasn't safe to show it. White women were taught to see his emotions as false, threatening, or pathetic. They weren't trained to recognize his humanity. They were trained to deny it, and they did. So he bled in silence, grieved in silence, endured in silence. They took his body, they took his labor, then they tried to take his tears. But deep inside, behind the blank stare and tight jaw, the emotion never left. It just waited. Not for their approval, but for the day someone would finally call it what it always was, humans. She made him a father, but never gave him a child. She forced him into her bed, took what she wanted, and when the child came, she sold it, not out of desperation, out of design. The child was never family, it was a product. He had no choice in creating that life, no voice in where it went. She chose everything, when, with whom, and how often. He was a stud, not a man. His worth was measured by how many children he could produce. But once they were born, they were taken, labeled, priced, sold. Sometimes the child looked like him, sometimes like her, half black, half white, but never free. She didn't keep them, she didn't raise them. She turned their birth into business, flesh into currency. And he watched, powerless, helpless, empty. There was no grieving process, no funeral for the living, no chance to say goodbye. He learned his child was gone the same way he learned his back would bleed, suddenly, without warning, and without mercy. He might pass them one day, on another plantation, in another field, wearing another master's name, but he could never speak, never protect, never claim. And she went back to sipping tea, writing letters, laughing at dinner as if she hadn't just severed something sacred. This wasn't just forced reproduction, it was generational cruelty, a cycle where love was forbidden, family was fractured, and children were currency. Every sail cut deeper, not just into his heart, but into the future he'd never have. A future she erased without blinking. She didn't just exploit his body, she shattered his bloodline and sold the pieces. The chains were removed, but the wounds stayed. What they did to him didn't end when slavery was abolished. It echoed through his children, through silence, through survival. The trauma passed down, invisible but alive, written in the way his grandson flinched at authority, in the way his great-grandson never cried, in the way his descendants still carry pain they can't fully name. He wasn't allowed to grieve, so grief became genetic. He wasn't allowed to protect his children, so protection became fear. He wasn't allowed to love freely, so love became guarded. These weren't habits, they were scars passed like inheritance. The humiliation he endured didn't vanish with time. It buried itself deep in memory, in behavior, in the bones of black families that had to heal without ever being told what broke them. Generational trauma isn't a metaphor. It's real. It's because of my high blood pressure, the anxiety around the police, the distrust of institutions, the silence around sexual violence, the shame that lingers for reasons no one can trace, because those reasons were erased along with the records. He was violated, stripped, used, and told to keep moving, and so his descendants did the same. Move forward, survive, but survival without healing is just pain in motion. White women who abused and sold and silenced him walked away with no consequence, but the damage they caused never left. The past isn't behind us. It's inside us. Until the full truth is named, until the suffering of black men is not softened, skipped, or buried, the trauma continues. Not in history books, but in households, because their bodies healed, but their lineage bled. And that blood is still flowing. Quiet, generational, unhealed. History loves half-truths. It teaches about whips, chains, cotton, and cruelty, but leaves out the parts that make people shift in their seats, the parts that stain more than just the white man's hands. It's easier to point at the overseer with the whip than the mistress with a smile. But if we only tell the story of slavery through one lens, if we only talk about the pain white men caused and ignore what white women did, we're not telling history. We're protecting a lie. She wasn't innocent. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't silent. She chose. She chose to humiliate, to violate, to sell the children she helped create. She chose to turn human beings into tools, into property, into profit. And for too long, we've let her vanish behind lace and excuses. Telling the whole truth isn't about guilt. It's about responsibility. It's about recognizing that every chain had more than one hand holding it, that every wound had more than one author, that the pain black men endured came from both the whip and the whisper, from the master and the mistress. This history is uncomfortable. It should be, but discomfort is not a reason to stay silent. In fact, it's the reason we must speak louder, because truth has a cost. And for centuries, that cost was paid by the enslaved, by men who were stripped of body, dignity, fatherhood, and voice. We owe them more than silence. We owe them clarity, honesty, the full weight of what was done. No more edits, no more softening. If we're brave enough to remember slavery, we must be brave enough to face all of it, even the parts that make us squirm, especially those